Great. So welcome everybody to this webinar from the British Association for Psychological Type. I'm Katherine Stothard. I'm the Director of Events for BAPT. And I'm going to give you a quick reminder of a couple of other events that are coming up before I introduce Katherine, our guest speaker today. So we've got two big events this year. One is our online conference on the 21st and 22nd of April. We have about 24 speakers. We've got 3 different streams: Type and Me, Type Practice, and Type at Depth. Got some amazing keynote speakers. And of course, it is a truly global conference, as in we've got speakers from the US, from Australia, from New Zealand, and the UK as well. So please look out for that on our website. I'll pop the link into chat in a minute, actually. And the other big event we've got this year, we're going to have a 2-day in-person workshop in London, not residential, so you would have to sort your own accommodation. And again, we've got some really great interactive, practical stuff that we'll be doing there. So it'd be great to see those of you who can reach the UK in person in London in June, 16th and 17th of June. I want to remind you about our YouTube channel. You can catch up on previous webinars. You can catch up on Richard Owen's In Conversation series on the YouTube channel at any time, because those are all publicly available. And please feel free to share them with anyone who might be interested in having access to some of our resources and materials. Anyway, this is actually the first webinar of 2023. So I'm delighted to welcome you here. Katherine Hirsh, who's well known to some of you, is our speaker. She's been using Type professionally and personally for 25 years, and she's the co-author of this, Type and Teams, which is, I've had this on my shelf for many years. It's a fantastic resource if you're doing Type with Teams. And yeah, I always looked up to people who could write stuff. So yeah, and as I said, I use that for my own work with Teams in the past. So she's a co-author of that, has done loads of other things, and is a content creator for STEP Research. She lives in Germany, I think. And this session, I think, is a topic that we've all struggled with at different times as Type practitioners, helping our clients find their best fit type, or even in the early days of knowing about your own type, being sure about your own best fit type. So I'm really excited to have Katherine here with us today. And over to you, Katherine.
Thank you for that lovely introduction. And as I reflect on Introduction to Myers-Briggs Type and Teams, that book is now 20 years old. The first edition of it came out in 2003. So that's pretty exciting. And that gives you a good idea of how engaging and interesting this topic is, that I've managed to be involved and active for those 20 years since the book came out. But my first interaction professionally with Type was all the way back in 1985. So my passion for it is a very long-term one, and coming up on, wow, that must be 40 years, which is very exciting. So for today, as Katherine so naturally said, the topic is looking at best fit type. And I've titled this, Why Can't I Be Both? Because this is a question that comes up quite regularly when you're doing interpretations, either individually or in a group setting. And so at the end of this session, I hope that you'll be able to appreciate some of the underlying assumptions behind the notion of best fit type and the completion of self-report instruments. Identify several common reasons for people's reported types, that is, their results, to differ from their true or best fit types. Be able to apply a variety of methods to help clients reach their best fit type, and commit to a client-centered approach that addresses client doubts and reaffirms that they are the best and indeed the only judges of true type. So let's start with an example. When talking about her preferences, Lois insists she is both an extrovert and an introvert because she is so socially skilled and loves reading. What assumptions or beliefs might lie behind Lois's conviction? If you could take a moment and post your ideas into the chat, that would be fantastic. So Catherine says, Lois has assumed that extroverts want company all the time. And Chris has said, why is my chat not working properly? That Lois assumes reading is only an introvert thing. Sharon, that sociality determines whether you have a preference for introversion or extroversion. Ingrid, that reading, again, is an activity that engages introversion. I think a number of people in book clubs would differ about how exciting is reading when you can do it as a group. Valerie says this should be about where you get your energy from and not about your social skills. Rowan, she assumes that introverts can't be socially skilled. So again, there's an issue about skills. Cindy reminds us that sociability is not I or E. Tamsin, being socially skilled is not about, or not only about extroverts. Tina, she thinks she's not allowed to use both preferences in everyday life, but only the one she chooses. Really great addition there. This sense that you've been put in a box by your type. Lynn, people think extroverts don't enjoy alone time. Again, this idea that because you prefer something, the characteristics that might be associated with the other preference are not something that's going to appeal to you. So before we had all of your ideas, I posted a few of my own. One of them that came up was that type is about preferences, preferability, not ability. So when you're working with clients and they have some doubts or they have questions about why they can't be both, you may want to take a moment to emphasize that type tools sort preferences. They're not there to measure someone's ability. They can't tell you, are you sociable? What level of sociability exists? Are you good at being alone? What degree to which do you feel comfortable being alone? That type is a both and, not an either or. So as a number of people suggested, we all do both sides of each preference dichotomy. And hopefully we do that when the situation demands, that we're responsive to our environments. We're not simply caricatures limited by what we prefer, unable to flex. Instead, we can do some of this and some of that, but we have a home base that we tend to gravitate toward. There's also the idea that there's a drive to wholeness. You'll want to point out that having a set of preferences is simply that. I prefer, I'm more comfortable, I feel more at home. However, that does not mean that this negates or rejects, or you have to negate or reject those other preferences. And in fact, Jung would suggest that this drive to wholeness is one of the key things that type opens up for us, letting us know that the way that we prefer may not be the only way, and certainly in certain circumstances may not be the best way. Type is also, when used properly, something that's holistic. So if you want to try and underscore that type is more than someone, wow. Underscore that type is more than who someone is at work. It reflects who someone is independent of setting. That in giving people the assessment, we want to give them the impression that they need to bring their whole self to thinking about it. When I was first trained, the discussion was, how do you encourage people to be their shoes off self and relate to the assessment as one about what you like every day, at work, at home, in this holistic sense. There also may be some issues around shame or around social norms. And some of those came out in people's comments about who was interested in reading, or who could spend time alone, or what was important about being social. So you want to try and impress upon clients that type tools are not tests, and therefore there are no right or wrong answers, and that none of their preferences are going to be unhealthy or inappropriate. And I think this is really important because it's rare that people take something that looks like a test and comes up with a result that they have control over, a result where there is not a right way to be, unless you want to say that there are 16 right ways, or in Dario Nari's or some of the other models, even a larger number than that. And again, type and this sort of self-assessment tool used to look at type is not a way to look at what's going to be healthy. It's not a measure of pathology. It's not a measure of what the most appropriate thing to do. It's a measure of what you prefer. And therefore, we can't use it to do diagnosis. So, reported type, that's the results. That's what you get when you've administered the instrument and you score it. Best fit type, in contrast, is, in my opinion, a discovery process, a team effort between someone who's skilled in type and someone who's curious and interested and wants to learn and discover more about themselves. So I'd just like to pause there and ask if there are any questions or any comments on our first time together, and also to take a look in the chat.
So Sharon's made a comment, which you're probably seeing, Katherine, about the lockdown. And I think there's been quite a lot written, hasn't there, about the effects of lockdown on our perceptions of whether we are really, more extroverted, more introverted, or whatever.
Sharon or Lynn, I noticed, also made a comment. Do either of you want to say a little bit more about the pandemic and extroversion, or any of your preferences?
I wonder if it has anything to do with, we're so busy and we finally had downtime. And so I think we were enjoying that downtime that we haven't had the luxury to have for a while. And to be able to think about, what we really want and, more towards that wholeness.
Sharon, you had your hand up for a second. Did you want to chime in?
Yeah, and I would say that I can just remember before the pandemic, just, obviously loving being around people more than anything in the entire world. And it felt like that when the pandemic occurred, that all of a sudden I felt more suspicious of people, and I wasn't as comfortable around them. I can remember going to exercise classes and being really frustrated about masking, not masking, all those kinds of things. And it just feels more tamped down. I don't remember ever feeling this way. And it's something I haven't been able to shake since the pandemic. And it just makes me wonder if there's not almost like a mental health kind of impact as a result of that. I mean, obviously, I still love people wholeheartedly, get my energy from being around people, but it's not the same. I feel more marginalized, I think, than I remember before, not by people, but by whatever that cloud is that came from that.
One of the things I think is interesting as someone with a preference for introversion, and from having talked to other people with the same preference, is for some of us, the pandemic actually opened up some of our relationships. Because we couldn't go out, we actually spent more time trying to connect with people because we didn't get any of the needs met by the incidental contacts that normally, at least for many introverts, might be sufficient to make us feel connected. And we had to be much more intentional and seek out social contact. Because again, it's not an either or, it's a both and. And if there's no obvious source for that, we might need to find another way to get it. And I see that Cindy has a hand up.
I
Would you
do.
like to jump in?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. I'm an ESTP, and I actually found the pandemic a relief in some aspects because my life is so in the outer world all the time, whether I'm teaching or designing, whatever it is I'm doing. And my husband, who's English, by the way, is a significantly clear introvert. And it allowed us to just be. And we learned how to communicate differently. And for me, it was more of a change than for him. It was being okay with the silence and prodding when I'd be like, okay, where are you? Because he's in his own monologue. And sometimes I just let him be. And sometimes I'm like, what's going on? So it was a very different couple of years.
Thank you all. And Catherine, I see that you made a comment too, and I like that. There wasn't the same sort of fear of missing out that there might have been in non-lockdown times. What I like about this little moment of discussion is it leads very nicely into some of the reasons why reported type might differ from best fit type. That is, things in people's contexts can influence the way in which they respond to items on whatever assessment, or even in looking at descriptions to try and figure out what feels like the right type for them. So one of the things that might influence someone's ability to determine their best fit type would be that they've responded on the inventory that they took in a manner that reflects what's esteemed in their family, their cultural background, rather than their personal preferences, attitudes, and values. For instance, gender. Tyrell says he can't possibly be a feeling type because men are supposed to be tough. Show of hands, how many of you have had either women like Catherine, Gail, myself, Ingrid, with a preference for thinking, who were initially uncertain, or someone like Tyrell in this example, who didn't feel like feeling could be the right fit because men are supposed to be tough. I think there are also examples where introversion and extroversion might have a relationship to someone's gender. That it's possible women are seen as much more chatty and talkative, and if you have that idea that extroversion is about sociability, more social, whereas men, the stereotype is stiff upper lip, strong silent type, and perhaps their ability to identify with preference for introversion might challenge some of the stereotypes that they're grappling with. There might be effects like the pandemic of the current circumstances on your reported type. Someone may respond in a manner that reflects what's currently happening in their lives, their family, their health, their finances, rather than by paying attention to their personal preferences, values, attitudes. Hector has just become a parent. He believes that he should follow a schedule to meet his child's needs and says that this must mean he has a judging preference. A few of you know my sister Elizabeth, and probably a few more of you know Jane Kesey. They regularly ran workshops together at schools, and they would talk about how their preferences, Jane with a preference for judging, Elizabeth with a preference for perceiving, when they became parents, really pushed them to stretch. They didn't start to doubt what their preference was, but they really began to realize the fact that the life circumstances they were now in were pushing them into a space where they needed to do much more flexing. Jane needed to think about how she could let up to give more room for spontaneity, for more options and choices, give her kids more agency in how they plan their time. And my sister Elizabeth had to think, how did she create a schedule? How did she help her daughter learn to navigate the fact that life often demands you do things at a specific time, even when a young ENTP would probably prefer to choose when, where, and even how to be following guidelines and showing up. Sorry, I missed a couple of good things in chat, and I'd just like to back up to those. So Sharon says, I worked with a client who has several males with feeling preferences in manufacturing. They were totally afraid to have this known because their plant manager was so harsh. A later plant manager came, an INFJ, and they felt such a sweet release. Cindy posted, I'm a New Englander and lived in Virginia for many years. It's significantly harder to identify EI in women in Virginia. I think that's really interesting. And I don't know if any of you know Vesa Ruthma from Finland. He often would tell a joke that he said was a Finnish joke, which is, how do you recognize the extrovert in Finland? Well, that's the person who's looking at your shoes instead of their own shoes. And I can remember the first time I visited Italy and the number of contexts in which greeting someone felt mandatory. And I'm guessing that for Italians, as with people in Virginia, there may be more difficulty in detecting which preference, introversion or extroversion, is important because the social situation demands acknowledging others, reaching out, talking, and identifying that external energy drive can look somewhat different when the culture is encouraging everyone to be as external. And Sharon probably has noticed when she leaves Birmingham, Alabama, and goes to other parts of the US that perhaps the welcoming The inquiring after how people are doing, the saying hello, is much less present than it would be in a culture that really rewards that extroverted. There might also be effects of work roles, perhaps as in that manufacturing example. So clients in their work setting or in their workday mindset may respond in a manner that reflects what's esteemed in that workplace rather than their personal preferences, their attitudes, and their values. So Ming explains she spends a lot of time meeting with people in her team role and believes this must mean she's an extrovert. Again, this also plays into that stereotype that type has something to do with being skilled, being able in a certain arena, when actually it's your preference, your energy source, the way in which you might recharge, whether you want to step in or take some time to step back. There might also be effects of team norms if you're looking in a team setting, particularly when trust is low and power is unevenly distributed on the team. Team members may slant their type toward the perceived norm. This protects them from the risk of seeming different. Because as you know, while we spend a lot of time trying to talk about how to celebrate differences, many times being different is not what's going to win you points and plaudits. Cindy's posted that I worked as an HR manager, clearly an ESTJ. When in meetings with the senior team, she flexed to ISFJ. She was the only woman at the senior level. We talked about it often. She's type savvy. It was how she was successful. I really like that story, Cindy, because it talks about both flexing and how self-awareness can lead to greater success. And recognition that when you flex, you're not being untrue to your type. You're simply using capacities that we all have appropriate to the circumstances we find ourselves in. And then there's a comment from Meta. I think when people find feeling more femme, it's because they associate it with feelings and emotions. We also need to explain what feeling means in the Jungian setting. I think the idea that there is a logic to feeling is something that often seems very surprising and not the normal association when we hear, how do you feel about this? It's an evaluation that takes into account the values, the people, the needs, and tries to tailor that to the situation. Thinking, on the other hand, often is looking to see how consistent we can be, how we can take the situation and the person out of the equation in order to evaluate what might be best. Once again, neither of these is going to be the complete answer, and we all need to tap into both. We just go to one place a little bit before we get energized to go to the other. In the team norms, the team leader complains. Here's another misuse of type. That Jeff, who has reported preferences for sensing and judging, should be a better bookkeeper given his preferences. Jeff, however, has only endorsed these preferences to fit with the team norm. I can recall working with a team where the team lead had ENTP preferences. And I wasn't too surprised to find that at least 3 people on the team had also reported ENTP preferences that were very, very slight. It turned out that only one of these people, when we did the interpretation, had a best fit type that matched her reported type. The other three had felt some pressure to endorse a type that reflected what they saw in their leader and saw it as an aspirational. So this was a more positive movement toward a team norm, but that can happen as well, and that someone may feel so desirous of looking like someone they admire that they choose those preferences instead of ones that fit with their own beliefs and norms and attitudes. So I'd like to pause again to have another quick go round. When you're trying to resolve sources of doubt and uncertainty, what has helped you, your clients, or important others in your life gain more clarity around best fit type? While you're thinking, Lynn has said, I worked with a leader who was a CPA by trade, and I assumed that he had like details until I put a worksheet together with the numbers, and he dismissed it. Big lesson in not assuming. Thanks, Lynn. It's true. We can take what people do at work and what they look good at as a reason to believe they have a type or a particular preference. And again, the assumption, as my dad used to say, are things that can make an ass out of you and me. Just some suggestions about how to get people to clarity, giving them some examples, asking them to reflect with lots of examples in different situations, giving them time to think, time to look it over, time to sit with a type. I think we can be really caught up in getting someone to best fit and underestimate how new or different not only the concepts are, but perhaps even the option to self-define, the option to take time and reflect and get some clarity. Rowan suggested, what were you like in your early 20s? Can indicate type before people became more well-rounded. That development might make it more difficult for people to identify type because they now feel comfortable in that flexing. They're not quite as one-sided. Reassurance that their type, whatever it is important and is accepted. Sharon. Lynn, again, giving people different scenarios to see how they might respond. Thinking about over the course of their life rather than at this moment to help people step away from what their immediate experience is pointing toward. And Katherine talked, this is a good point because she thinks she's definitely moving into developing those less preferred aspects inside as she gets older. Couple of agreements, trying the separate everyday behavior, to separate everyday behavior from preferences, what is more natural. And I think that's one of the things that I like about type is it actually helps people to look at everyday behavior in a new way. It's not simply about who you are at work or what roles you've learned. It's what you would prefer, what you could choose were you to be able to just do what comes naturally. Cindy, I believe the questions are the answers. When someone is unclear, I'll pick up on something they said and respectfully dig a bit deeper by questioning, and people eventually see their preferences, knowing they can do both. Chris, I ask them what their gut tells them, trying to get them grounded, put out of their heads. Ingrid, which preferences would you not be without? Catherine, I hope there's a way we can actually save the information in the chat. Do you know if that's possible?
Yes, it'll automatically download to my computer at the end when we've finished the session, and I can save it and I can send it to you, Catherine, if you'd like. In fact, I guess I could send it to everyone with the recording if they'd like that. Because there are, as you there's some good stuff coming into chat.
I think that would be fabulous. So, a couple of ideas of mine on doing the best fit discovery process to follow on all of these great ideas. And I think luckily for me, no one suggested the things I'm going to talk about. So this is great. I have some new ideas. So the first idea is to use your type table as a best fit type tool. And I have two suggestions here. One is to have people look at adjacent types. And the second is to have people look at opposite types. Now, this is the type table that I prefer. It's the one I grew up using. One I grew into using as a practitioner. It's the one that I can talk about how Isabel Myers designed it to reflect relationships between the types. However, the concept of using relationships among different types is applicable to other layouts. So Danielle Poirier has a beautiful way of representing type where she has organized it into 4 overlapping circles, which are colored according to the dominant function, where the 4 intuitive types, the 4 sensing types, the 4 thinking types, and the 4 feeling types have been grouped together. On the outside of these circles, the extroverted, the intuitive types appear. On the inside, it's the introverted. So like Isabel Myers, she's used the structure to try and indicate something about the way those preferences map onto what's happening in the world. So I will often talk about the type table and say, at the top here, like in the United States, as we were hearing earlier, there's this sense of you're a bit quieter. The northern folks tend to be a little bit quieter, or the Finnish example. And then when we get to the south, there's a little bit more of this gregariousness, a little bit more wanting to be out in that world and being energized by other people. In addition, if I look at my own type, INTP, I can look and see, well, there's INFP, INTJ, ENTP, and if I swap to the other side, ISTP. I can also then look over to ESFJ. And I got the idea for looking at your opposite type from an essay of Marie-Louise von Francis about the inferior function. And she talks about a way to identify your dominant function by the function that's the least appealing to you, the one that feels uncomfortable and odd or strange. And while I don't advocate inviting people to think about a particular type as odd or strange, it is the case that when people look at their opposites, they often have a very clear sense that this is a not me situation. While they can see the value, it's not what feels natural, comfortable, or typical for them. It's something, if they do it, if it is in their repertoire, they've developed that on the basis of work that they've done rather than something that felt right and true just from the start, from being who they are. Ah, so Mark, I see, has put a diagram with preferences in circles and how they show relationships, and he's put that into chat if people would like to be able to download that. Thank you, Mark. A second option that I think works very well is to use type lenses as a best fit tool. I'm going to use a dynamics lens example, looking at your cognitive functions, and then an essential motivators or temperaments lens example. I'm going to use some material that my sister and I developed. However, I'd urge you to try this using your own favorites. And a shout out here to some of the great cards people have helped develop that can really be useful in doing best fit type. So Tina and Meta have their how cards. Katherine Stothart has cards on interaction styles. Cindy Paris has developed cards on the 8 functions. Susan Nash has multiple sorts of cards. And Sue Blair has something she's called the type trilogy, where she looks at people's essential motivators or temperament, their interaction styles, and their cognitive functions all at once. I think all of these can be great material to help people when they're having difficulty identifying best fit type. So to give you a few examples, rather than focusing on the preference dichotomy, introversion and extroversion, you might try focusing on the dominant function or the cognitive dynamics. So if someone is struggling between ISFP and ESFP, you might have them look more closely at, are they someone who says, first and foremost, like the ISFP in this example, give me purpose? Are they someone who worries that values will not be respected? Are they someone who wants to be seen as cooperative? Alternatively, do they resonate more with the sensing dominant ESFP, who says, give me facts, and worries that details may be overlooked and wants to be seen as pragmatic? So they share quite a bit in common, but what we're asking them to look at here is not whether they prefer introversion and extroversion, but something that gets to an aspect of their whole type and their dominant function. Rather than focusing on judging or perceiving, which can also be difficult, you might have an ENTP, someone trying to decide between ENTP and ENTJ, looking at whether they feel most at home intuitive dominant or thinking dominant. The ENTP asking, please give me the possibilities, being worried that creativity will be stifled and wanting to be seen as imaginative. The ENTJ asking, give me reasons, worrying that logical principles might not be upheld, wanting to be seen as objective. They're going to share quite a bit through sharing extroversion, intuition, and thinking, but this helps them to focus on something else other than, do I have a preference for J or P, and thinking through these two types. Rather than focusing on sensing or intuition, you might use the temperaments or essential motivators lens. So if someone is struggling between ISFP and INFP, the improviser or the catalyst, you might have them look at, is there a way we can make it fun to do the interpretation? Might see if they're interested in being counted on in terms of being adaptable, whether they tend to exhibit playfulness, improvising, troubleshooting. With the INFP, we might want to focus on making it meaningful. Ask if they can feel they want to be counted on for being imaginative, whether they try when they're speaking to convey understanding, to motivate and advocate. Again, by pulling back from this difficulty of the either or on the dichotomy and trying to engage them with something richer about the whole types, it can be very helpful in moving them away from this. I'm stuck this way or I'm stuck that way. I think the next thing that's very important is that you make your interpretation something that's client-centered, that you make their agenda your agenda. So normalize the questioning process. People talked about this quite a bit in their suggestions. To remind clients that confusion doesn't mean that anything is wrong with them or with the type tool. And in fact, I think someone who unquestionably immediately accepts the results is probably not having the experience that's optimal. That questioning, that grappling with a set of letters, which feels very abstract, and getting to what that might mean, wondering, is this telling me something new, different, and true about myself, rather than accepting at face value? Because I think often when we simply accept, we then move on without doing any work. We don't make something our own. We're not as interested or engaged with finding out more. It feels like a label that's simply been slapped on. Similarly, addressing people's questions about why it is that they've been allowed to self-select helps them normalize the importance of living out a type that fits for you and not feeling that you need to be a particular way or that there's a one right or true or healthy or appropriate way to be. Time was mentioned, and I think it's really important to allow clients to defer selecting a preference until they have lived with it for a little while, especially given the cultural norms that might suggest it's not appropriate to be A, B, C, or D. You may need to live with what that would feel like to acknowledge it. And some people may live with a type for a long time and decide later that they had chosen a type that met someone else's needs, that someone else or some other ideas than their own personal preferences were driving them. So you may also want to welcome clients re-examining best fit type, even if it has been quite a while since they last explored who they were. And that there's no shame in saying, I was wrong, I know more, I'm more aware now. And I think also stress that a person's psychological type should be regarded as a working hypothesis. This is something that needs to be useful. It's something that needs to be helpful, something that needs to open up possibilities. It's something you can use to generate ideas. Why did I behave this way now? Is there something about who I am that I could think about more clearly to behave in a way that was more appropriate to the situation, even if that feels less natural to me? So keeping open the idea that we are all a work in process and a work in progress, and that our type is something that can stretch and grow. Be willing to accept uncertainty. Some clients may not need to have a 4-letter type to feel they have benefited from learning about type. In fact, I often say, if people come away with the notion that there are a variety of different and valid styles, and that person who drives me crazy is almost never, occasionally, but almost never the 17th or the JERK type, but instead simply someone who does it different from what I do. I don't need to remember my 4 letters or their 4 letters to take a moment to step back and say, that person's not the jerk. That person is doing it a different way, and a way that if I can look at it as potentially valuable, I can find synergies and benefits and perhaps even learn something that I might be able to then try out and stretch. A few final thoughts, and then I'd love to have some time to hear from you. First, respond to questions like, why can't I be both? By letting clients know that they can be and they are. We are both of each of these preferences. They're set up as dichotomies to help us draw out the differences, but that doesn't mean we have to fall back on being one or the other. Instead, we can be our full selves, stretching, being. Reinforce that people prefer one preference, but that does not mean that they reject or are incapable of employing or enjoying, indeed, the other preference. And it sounds like from our discussion earlier in the pandemic that some of us found a deeper enjoyment, a new enjoyment of some non-preferred ways of being that were forced on us, but may actually have turned out to be giving us some insights into the values of that diverse part of ourselves. Highlight the fact that type should not be used as an excuse for doing or not doing something. I shouldn't feel that I can say, well, I have a preference for thinking, so I don't have to care about the logic that involves people creating harmony, developing my values and trying to live authentically by them. It should also be an excuse, no excuse for not reaching out, for sharing my feelings, for being comfortable expressing those values, that I might be judged somehow as less than or less worthy because I've stretched to try and include some approaches that value feeling. Share the good news that by learning about what they prefer, people will be able to discern when to choose to use those preferences and when to flex to their opposites. Thank you so much for spending time with me and for the chance to share a few of my ideas and to learn from you. And I'd love right now to continue the conversation and to continue it going forward via email. And so I've included my email address here. And now I'd like to send it back to Katherine to open it up for a bit of discussion.
Great. Thank you, Katherine. Yes, so please don't all rush off, because Katherine and I are happy to stay here for up to half an hour for a bit of discussion and sharing and so on. But I will just do the formal thanks now, and then I'll stop the recording. So in case people are not wanting their comments to be recorded. So thank you so much to Katherine Hirsh for a really insightful presentation there, and loads of good ideas. I mean, I especially liked the ideas of using the dynamics. And by the way, Sterling Bates is going to be talking about the dynamics at our conference. And I like the idea of using the dominant function to help people decide whether they're, is it E or I, and using that, and using temperaments to help decide. I think those other ideas were so much more more advanced, really. Deeper than we'd come up with in the chat anyhow. So it's been a really helpful session, and I'm sure we'll all be able to put into practice, Katherine, some of what you've shared with us today. So thank you very much. And should we all give her a sort of virtual or whatever clap? And I'm going to stop the recording now, and then we'll carry on with a bit of a chat.